Welcome to Books of Titans. I'm Jason Staples together with Eric Rostad, and this podcast is dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectual scientists, and others. And we'll talk about what makes these books so important and influential, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about these important works.
Today we're going to cover the book Walden by Henry David Thoreau, a book focused on sticking it to the man while being removed from the man. Good old Tim Ferriss recommended the book. He's at tim.blog, which reminds me, a good friend of mine named Josh had the wherewithal to purchase josh.com back in the day, but failed to set it to auto-renew. So he lost josh.com, but he did own it for a while. And I always give him a hard time about that because, man, he could have sold that for so much money. So we know Tim. I wanted to pull out a few different things about him. He holds a Guinness World Record in Argentine tango. And there's also this thing called the Tim Ferriss effect. In 2012, author Michael Ellsberg coined the phrase the Tim Ferriss effect in a Forbes profile. The phrase was used to describe the influence a blog post on Ferriss's site had on the sales of Ellsberg's book. Ellsberg found that his post on Ferriss's blog sold more books than a piece in the New York Times and a 3-minute segment on CNN. So there's some influence for you from Sir Ferriss himself. So the book we're reading or discussing today is Walden. Author Henry David Thoreau, born in 1817, died 44 years later in 1862. He was an American essayist, poet, philosopher, abolitionist, naturalist, tax resister, development critic, surveyor, and historian. He was good friends with Emerson, and I believe Walden was a property owned by Emerson. And then Thoreau lived on other properties owned by Emerson in his lifetime. And despite being dead, he has quite the active Twitter following with 37,400 followers at Thoreau Page. So you can check that out. It's just a lot of quotes that a lot of which we'll be reading today and going over, but a lot of quotes from Walden and some of his other writings. So anything to add there?
Not much. I mean, I think if you want to learn more about Thoreau, there's plenty of stuff out there. I mean, the guy's been studied quite a bit, ironically, actually, in many universities and so on since. So, yeah, not much more to say about that. But let's go ahead and get to talking about the book. Start with some big picture reflections. This one is one that, honestly, I was a little embarrassed not to have read previously. As an allegedly educated man,
learned man.
Yeah, as an allegedly learned man, this is one book that I really should have read before undertaking this project of going through these books for the podcast. So I was really, really excited, actually, to get the chance to read this one. This one was one of the ones right at the top of my list when Eric first started putting this list together. It's like, oh yeah, that one's one I really want to make sure I read because, I should have read it already.
Yeah, same with me.
And it didn't disappoint, frankly. I actually I found I got more out of the book than I expected to. And this is certainly what we're on book 18 here of the list. This is certainly one of the best books on this list and one that I would recommend pretty much every reader. You need to read this. It's a book that it's going to challenge, maybe in some cases upset, but certainly confront every reader who takes a look at it, and that's by design. And I think he forces us to reconsider what's really valuable in life, and what are we really here doing? Like, what are we messing around doing? Like, what are we really willing to put our money where our mouth is in terms of what we truly value, or are we really just paying lip service to what we say we value while we actually have other agendas in mind? Are we willing, or do we want to be, just instruments of the man, or do we want to actually be human beings who do something of worth in our lives, and in Steve Jobs' language, put a ding or a dent in the universe? All that's there in Walden, and it's definitely something that I recommend every reader read. At least read through the first half of it. The portions dealing with the more philosophical material, because once he gets into the naturalistic reflections on on Walden Pond, and this is how deep it was at this time of year and all that, I found that pretty worthless. But the other portion before that was great. I'm sure that part is worth something to scientists and naturalists today who are looking at maybe the impact of climate change or something like that. How much things have changed now from then. Sure, that's all fine and dandy, but I really, I don't care all that much about that.
But if they miss the second part of the book, they miss the most epic battle scene I've ever read.
Oh, that is true. I forgot about that. That is true.
And of course, I'm referring to the epic ant battle. Before reading this book, I never knew such a thing existed, and I was just blown away. I mean, he went into detail about how ants were just sitting there like chewing each other's legs off, and gnawing at heads to get them off, and like it was an epic battle between two different groups of ants. Yeah. And he just sat there and watched it. One
colony against another, and he just had the leisure to sit there and give us the play-by-play. And actually, he would have done pretty well as a play-by-play commentator, frankly, because he did a nice job summarizing how all that went. It was riveting there. So yeah, read the first half and that.
and the ant battle.
And the ant battle. You got to read the ant battle.
So if you are unfamiliar with the book, basically Thoreau took 2 years of his life and lived at Walden Pond, and then wrote about it. He was there for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. The book is actually presented as a 1 calendar year, but the actual time that he spent in Walden Pond was those little more than 2 years. And this is something.
And just for the record, he was a squatter at Walden Pond.
Yeah.
He just decided, I'm going to build my house here on somebody's property.
Yeah. So, being able to do this in this day and age, probably not, unless you, get a camouflage tiny house or something. Probably not going to be able to do what he did. But what I found interesting, and I didn't know until reading this book, is that he spent a lot of his childhood here. So in a way, this is almost taking back to childhood, the innocence of childhood, the simplicity of childhood, and trying to recapture that in some way. And so I actually connected with that a lot, and we're discussing a little bit, but that's the basic premise. It's the book is called Walden and Civil Disobedience. So he also gets into some
civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is actually a separate treatise, a separate pamphlet that is usually added on to Walden, and it's definitely added on to the edition that I chose to read. One of which was there was some audiobook. There's an audiobook. Actually, I I made the mistake of purchasing the audiobook through Audible, and that in itself wasn't a mistake, actually. When getting ready for this project, because the mistake that I made was I purchased the book through Audible, only to discover after I had finished the book, and was dealing with all the notes and everything that I'd taken, that I had also purchased the book, another edition of the audiobook through Audible, like 3 or 4 years ago or 5 years ago, when I intended to read it then.
Well, where's Amazon's big data helping you to realize that?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably in their interest to make sure that I do buy it twice. So,
Yeah.
that's the way it works. But I mean, the audiobook was very well done, so I don't have too many complaints. But I did cost myself a credit with that one. Oh well.
Ouch. Well, let me preface just for the reason that he went to the woods for 2 years. This is a pretty famous paragraph that if you've watched Dead Poets Society, you probably heard parts of this. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see it if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. For most men, it appears to me, are in strange uncertainty about it, whether it is of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. So we can hit in the conclusion. We can discuss if he reached his goal of living deliberately, but that was his stated purpose for going into the woods. And like you, Jason, I had a great appreciation for this work. Had never read it before, and it took me a while to get through it. It took me 2 weeks. It should have only taken one, but for some reason it's a relatively short book, but for some reason it just took me a while to
it actually took me even though I did a good portion of this via audiobook, it actually took me a little while as well. And I think that's partly because it's one of those books that you have to chew on some.
Yeah.
And I think that might have been it. This is not one that I struggled with at all, but it's one that did take me a little longer just because I kept wanting to reflect a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, going through the notes, just even to prepare for this, it's amazing how much is packed in the book and how much really good stuff. So let's get into that good stuff. You want to start with a quote, one of your favorites?
Yeah, and this book I really liked this book a lot, and it's got a ton of things that I could list as a favorite quote here. I mean, it just I'm having to cut out some of my favorites just to narrow down to the absolute favorites. We could be here all day with a lot of the ones that I liked, but let's see. One of my favorites here is every generation laughs at the old fashions, but follows religiously the new.
I had a star by that one.
Oh man,
that was good.
and actually, that reminded me of C.S. Lewis's. There's a C.S. Lewis essay that I have. Every introductory class that I teach, I require them to read this little essay that was actually the preface to an edition of Athanasius on the Incarnation when Lewis initially published it, but now it's published separately as a part of an essay collection called On the Reading of Old Books, where Lewis talks about how, basically every generation looks back on prior generations and things that they agreed upon and just says, well, how could they have believed that? Mm-hmm. And he says, and of course others will come along after us and ask the same thing. And, we're all victims of fashion, intellectually and otherwise. And for Lewis, the best way to insulate oneself from that is to make sure that you read books from other eras. Read the old books, he says, because, the best solution would be to read the books from the next generation. But since those aren't yet written and we don't have access to them, the only way we can go is to go backwards and be critiqued by those who came before us. And the foreignness of their fashions and the foreignness of their voice can at least help us a little bit there. And I found Thoreau to be doing that in his own era. And of course, Thoreau is really big in this on the importance of reading the classics and reading the stuff that has stood the test of time.
Mm-hmm.
So he and Lewis are of a piece there.
And did Lewis have a formula for that? Like you should read
Yes,
one book
actually.
to every two
Yeah,
new ones?
he says that that it's a good rule that for every one newer book or more modern book of your own era you read, you should read 2 old books. And he said, and if that's too difficult for you, if that's too much, then at least try to do 1 to 1.
Yeah. It's good, a good rule. My first favorite quote is a famous one. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. I think that's pretty evident.
So you got nothing more to say on that one?
That's all I got.
Gonna let it speak for itself?
I'm gonna let that one speak for itself.
All right. Another one that I really liked. Most men appear never to have considered what a house is, and are actually, though needlessly poor, all their lives, because they think that they must have such a one as their neighbors have.
And he goes into that too, and talking about building his own house and how he wouldn't trade that for a luxurious house.
Well, yeah, I mean, he talks about how luxury and a couple of my other quotes. My next one actually will be addressing that. He talks about how luxury can interfere with other things, but with the higher pursuits of life. But what he's really getting at here is, what do you really need? What do you really value in a house? What do you really value in your living scenario, in your living situation, and how much of what you are actually pursuing is something way beyond that, and you're actually working for stuff that you don't really actually at the end of the day want or need. And he's like, if you just considered like getting a house that only had the space and amenities that you actually wanted or needed, then it'd be a lot cheaper and you wouldn't have to work as much and you'd be happier and all of that. But because you think your house needs to have all the stuff that your neighbor's does, well, now you're going to be working for a long time. So
what's the quote? It's like, you spend all your time in a job you hate to impress neighbors you don't like. My next quote goes right in with that. For a man is rich in proportion to the number of things that he can afford to let alone. Good rule to live by. And I'll connect one other one with that. And the cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it immediately or in the long run. That's a good way to think of things that we purchase is, how much time does this cost me in work or time away from the things I love? How much is it going to cost me now? If I pay for it right now, or in the future, if I pay for it with debt, how much time is this thing going to cost me?
Or and we've talked about this a lot on this podcast, about how time really is money, that money is liquid time in that sense. Another way to think about that is to think about it as life. It's not just time, it's life.
Yeah.
How much of my life am I spending for this thing? Like I'm actually giving up my life for X. How much of my life is it worth? And he forces that economic equation to be considered over and over again through this book, and that to me is really probably the biggest value of the book. Is it just forces, in a lot of ways, this is a meditation that serves very much the same kind of purpose as the book of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet in the Hebrew Bible, where it's basically saying, listen, you're going to die. You're going to die at some point. Now, what's really valuable then? In light of the fact that you're going to die, what are you going to do? What's really valuable to you? And then how much of the things that you are pursuing are really just chasing after wind, to use Ecclesiastes terminology or turn of phrase there? How much are you just chasing after the wind in spending your life after this thing that really has no value, that when you actually take a step back and you look at it, you go, oh, yeah, that's kind of worthless. And that's what he wants the reader to come to face to face with that over and over and over again. So that was actually one of my favorite quotes as well. And I'll build on that with the next one. Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind. And he basically, elsewhere, he says, luxury just basically is its own fruit. It just produces, softness and nothing more, basically. It doesn't actually produce anything of value, anything of permanence, anything that makes human beings, happier and nicer to one another.
And if anything, the opposite.
Yeah,
you're fighting to get them.
Yeah, since you have something that's really nice, now you'll fight to defend it, or you'll fight to go and get it from someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a good one. I see you've got some on education, so I'll get us rolling on some education quotes. And in this one, he's referring to the young person who goes to college, and here's where the quote starts. While he is reading Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Say, he runs his father in debt irretrievably. Which was just a hilarious quote. So while the kid is sitting there reading about economics and debt and money, his father is actually going into debt to such a degree that it'll be hard to get out of it, so that he can read about it.
Student loans, man. Right?
Yeah.
Right? Or as a quote from a movie that you and I both love, this is the 19th century version of, you wasted $150,000 on an education you could have got for $1.50 in late fees at the public library. Right?
Yep.
That's Thoreau's like Thoreau has a whole section that's basically his version of that quote from Good Will Hunting.
Yeah.
Where I love where he says, pertaining to education, the things for which the most money is demanded for university education are never the things which the student most wants. And is that if Thoreau were alive today, he'd be going, see, I told you, it's even worse now. Yeah. Because then he's pointing to tuition, right? He says, tuition, for instance, is an important item in the term bill. While the far more valuable education, which the person gets by associating with the most cultivated of his contemporaries, no charge for that. For the far more valuable education, which he gets by associating with the most cultivated of his contemporaries, no charge is made. And, again, the real value for him of going to college is you get to be around other cultivated people for, interesting conversations and all of this. And, that's actually not the thing you're getting charged for.
Yeah.
Well, now it's even worse, right? Because most of the bloat in higher education isn't going even to pay your professors and pay the things that you would imagine tuition would be for. It's to pay for the really cool facilities and the student recreation center and, athletics and, although in many cases athletics is a separate entity in terms of the budget line. So, but either way, it still feeds into the overall bloat. Really cool, luxury style dorms that will be nicer than any place you will ever live the rest of your life, thanks in part to the debt that you're racking up to go to college to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, he is ahead of his time. Like it's one of those things when you look at an old book, and again, this is what C.S. Lewis says about old books. Basically, the benefit of old books is the new ones haven't been tried out, right? The new ones haven't really been, they haven't been tested yet. And so, the problem is that you don't know whether, unless you're really an expert, generally speaking, and even the experts can be deceived. The problem is that the new books aren't completely tested out yet. The old ones have had long enough that, basically whether or not they stay applicable and whether or not they really still speak truth to, 2 generations later when people go, wow, that guy really got it. Mm-hmm. That's the test. Well, this one is one of those, right? It's like, oh man,
yeah,
what he said then was true then, and it's even more true now, right? And that's the real test of a great old book. And this one passes the test, I'd say 9 times out of 10. There are a few places where I look at him and I go, but those were few and far between.
Yeah. Well, and read your navigation quote there, because that was awesome.
Yeah. So this is another one. I've got this in the show notes, is definitely on my favorite list, where he says, "To my astonishment, I was informed on leaving college that I had studied navigation. Why, if I'd taken one turn down the harbor, I should have known more about it." And again, that's so true. That you get business majors that like some of the business majors that I've been friends with over my years since college, and you of course majored in business, so you can relate to this. Like I talk to them about business or entrepreneurship or whatever, and both they and I are shocked by what they did not learn and what they should have learned in business school. It's like, how in the world did we cover like this aspect of things, which has never been valuable, which has no relevance to anything that I've done in the business world since, but we didn't cover that.
Yeah. The one that always, and I'm speaking as someone who went through undergrad and grad school for international business, and we did not have one lecture on pricing. How do you price your product or service? What goes into that? If you are in the service industry, how do you price that? Do you price it based on, does if you work for someone like a small client, is it the same charge for a huge client? Like basics here, and never discuss that. So, and for business school, they're really geared towards getting you to work in a corporation. I mean, that's the classes are about working in a corporation, not necessarily doing your own thing. But
there's now schools of entrepreneurship that have begun. I mean, there was a huge grant, for example, or a huge gift that is given to Florida State University, for example, where I graduated from, to start a really innovative entrepreneurship program there. My wife was an entrepreneurship minor at UNC, but even in those cases, there's so much stuff where it's like, how in the world did that not get covered?
Well, in what I saw, because I had entrepreneurship courses in grad work that changed my life, but it was because of one professor, and he this is going to shock you, but he was actually an entrepreneur.
Oh, wow.
So they actually let an entrepreneur teach the course, whereas all the other professors, I was just lucky that I got him, because all the other professors were not entrepreneurs. So you had guys teaching entrepreneurship that had never actually started a company. And so all you're doing there is just looking at textbooks about entrepreneurship. But I was fortunate that the guy had actually taught it. He'd gone bankrupt. He'd seen the highs and the lows, and learned a lot from him. But I think most of the programs out there are going to be taught by non-entrepreneurs.
And in order to be, truly just in pointing to, business school, where it's an easy one to talk about that this stuff's true in my field as well. I mean, people graduate from religious studies with a religious studies program, from a religious studies program or a classics program or whatever. You get someone that you can graduate from with a classics degree and never have read, say, the Timaeus or the Republic. It's totally possible.
Yeah.
You can pass your PhD exams in an area of say New Testament or something like that, and not really have a good grasp of some of the major primary texts. But if you can speak intelligently about what certain scholars have said in other areas, then that's fine.
Yeah, it seems to me it's more about the criticism of it. And so what I saw, like a good buddy of mine out of college, we would meet once a week and talk about books and talk about life. And he was a literature major, and he was getting his PhD in literature and just burned out to the point where he quit mid program. And we would talk like, so surely you've read Moby Dick, and what do you think of it? He's like, oh well, I actually never read Moby Dick. And well, surely you've read this book. No, I actually, but we read about how that book was a result, and the author was, it was because he was part of the British Empire, and they were in India at the time. So it was, it was written from this point of view. So I can tell you all about this particular book from that vantage point, but I've actually never read the book.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I've found in my field as well. People don't.
It's
People,
a shame.
people, and even in some cases, I haven't read everything that I should have, but I've been more fastidious about trying to read that stuff than most. But the general thing is that we substitute the second thing, the learning the scholarship about, rather than doing the thing itself. And again, that's what so much of this book is about, is that aspect of, not sacrificing the higher for the lower, right? Not going for learning criticism over actually reading the book, right? And actually one of my next quotes is precisely about that, where he says, "It is life near the bone where it is sweetest. You are defended from being a trifler. No man loses ever on a lower level by magnanimity on a higher. Superfluous wealth can buy superfluities only. Money is not required to buy one necessary of the soul." And to abbreviate that, basically, he says, listen, giving up something on to focus on the higher level of things, you don't lose on the lower levels to do that. And so he wants to really point out that in order for life to be better, you have to really reassess all at various points what's truly valuable and focus on what's truly valuable. And if you do that, you don't lose anything by sacrificing the stuff that's not valuable for it.
When he's got a quote about news where you read the news, and by the time it's the afternoon, it's really not applicable anymore. And one thing,
and he says, if you just change the names, the same thing will be there tomorrow.
Yeah. And this probably is not going to be a good overall trend in my life, but this year I've completely given up news. And the main reason is so I can get through these books and have the time to do that. I mean, I used to subscribe to the New York Times. I would get it every morning and pore over it for a long time. And then just, recently I'll just get caught up in the different feeds of news, and it just was not good. And so I've gone the other side of the pendulum and just completely given it up this year. And my wife will tell me what's going on every now and then, but otherwise I've not missed a thing. And I mean, to be able to read some of these books and have the time to do that instead of going through news, it's definitely the better thing. So long term, I'm probably, missing out on keeping up with things, but so far it's been pretty relieving.
Yeah, and he actually says some things about that in terms of his lack of concern for government. I'm pretty sure this was in the on civil disobedience, but I think it's fair, since most editions have that in there as well, that he talks about how, honestly, like, why are we really concerned about government? Like, government really doesn't matter that much, frankly. And he talks about this, that here, let me find it. Yeah, this is the quote. He says, "The government does not concern me much, and I shall bestow the fewest possible thoughts on it. It is not many moments that I live under a government, even in this world. If a man is thought-free, fancy-free, imagination-free, that which is not, never for a long time appearing to be to him, unwise rulers or reformers cannot fatally interrupt him." And actually, this gets me to thinking about, there's so, like, I'm in higher ed, and a lot of my colleagues are just wringing their hands constantly on social media, in the hallway, everywhere else, about the current president of the United States and the potentially, all of the negative things in the current administration. And while I agree with them that the current president is an embarrassment to the United States, and that, I don't approve of the way that the current administration handles a great many things. At the same point, I felt about the last administration that there were a great many things that the last administration did that I really didn't think were good ideas, that they were the right way to go about things. And, the funny thing is, almost nothing that either one has done has had really direct impact on most people's actual everyday lives.
Yeah.
And yes, it's important to, if there's going to be some major impact on lives and so on, I'm not saying don't complain or don't, take political action. I think that there's a time and a place for that. But at the same time, waking up every morning to check the news to see what idiotic thing was tweeted out, it's just a recipe for heartburn. The tweets that this man makes are really not affecting you. He's just an idiot.
The funny thing is, though, Thoreau says that the only people that ever harassed him in his life were from the government.
Yeah.
Coming for tax money and stuff. So it's pretty funny.
Yeah. So, but again, I mean, it does lead to a much quieter and usually more valuably spent life if you're not obsessing over the latest thing tweeted out by some governmental leader.
Yeah.
Now, actually working toward, reform that helps people in various ways and resisting bad legislation and all that. Because, he talks a good bit. And again, this has aged very well in this respect. On the same, on the next page, after he says that the government doesn't concern me much, he's talking about how abolition of slavery is imperative and that slavery is an embarrassment and a blight upon the United States, and that it would be better for the U.S. to cease to exist than for slavery to continue. Mm-hmm. So, he's right. And he does show that there are issues to really get up in arms about. But then there's the focus on the obsessive, little things in the news that, dude, don't let it affect you. Like what was said there doesn't actually impact you in the least. Just move on and put your attention where it matters. Whatever today's slavery issues are, focus on those things and do what you can to fix those. And just voting is probably not going to be enough.
Mm-hmm. Well, in line with that, I've got a quote. If I knew for a certainty that a man was coming to my house with the conscious design of doing me good, I should run for my life.
Yep, that was in my list as well.
That one reminds me of Reagan's famous quote of someone saying, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And if someone says that, to run.
Yeah, it's the scariest words, scariest sentence in the English language. I'm with the government and I'm here to help. Yeah, it reminds me of my dad's old saying about when you see a preacher coming, make sure you grab your wallet and your wife. Preacher's coming. He's, I see him coming. All right, where's my wallet? Where's my wallet? All right, I'm good.
Speaking of preachers, you've got a religious quote here.
Yeah. So he critiques the constant building projects that everybody's engaged in, and civilizational building, and the cult of progress, and that runs from railroads and telegrams in his day to buildings and so on. And he says the religion and civilization, which are barbaric and heathenish, build splendid temples. But what you might call Christianity does not. Most of the stone a nation hammers goes toward its tomb only. It buries itself alive. As for the pyramids, there is nothing to wonder at in them so much as the fact that so many men could be found degraded enough to spend their lives constructing a tomb for some ambitious booby, whom it would have been wiser and manlier to have drowned in the Nile and then given his body to the dogs.
Yikes. Yeah.
I'm just going to let that one speak for itself.
Yeah, there's not much we could say on that one. It's awesome. So here's my final one. Thus it seemed that this one hillside illustrated the principle of all of the operations of nature. The maker of this earth but patented a leaf. And here he's probably in that. In fact, it is in that second section where he's talking more about his surroundings and the beauty of the lake and foliage and animals and all sorts of stuff. And this one struck me. And just as I walk around with my daughter in areas where there's trees, I just always marvel and try to get her to marvel at the simplicity of a leaf. And just, I mean, you pick up a leaf and there's like veins going throughout it and then, how that was connected to a tree. And sometimes I just sit there and look at that leaf and I'm like, if I could just understand everything that went into this leaf, I mean, it's like this holds all the secrets right here. And it's just one small leaf. And so I loved that quote, the maker of this earth, but patented a leaf. And that just one hillside, just going deep into one hillside, for him, Walden, spending time in this small area, this one hillside illustrated the principle of all of the operations of nature. I thought that was just brilliant and a awesome thing to consider.
Yeah, and and again, I do want to point out that the way we're reading this book, we're reading the book itself. We're not spending a whole lot of time on the history of some of the little bit of hypocrisy, for example, that actually, underlies some of the book, and he doesn't hide it exactly in terms of his own hypocrisy. I mean, he brings it up a couple times, but the reality that Walden wasn't really that far from anything else, and his mother would bring him cookies and, extra provisions and different things at different points that he doesn't really mention.
Well, in the book, Generations, that we have coming up, that they actually hit on that quite a bit about Thoreau's hypocrisy.
Yeah, Thoreau, was a human being, and generally speaking, with few exceptions, that makes him a hypocrite in some areas, but that doesn't negate what he's saying here.
No.
And I think that it's important to read the book, read what he actually has to say, and to take it to heart as much as we can, and get what we can out of it.
Yeah, I was actually in hearing about this book my whole life, I just assumed that he was a hermit for 2 years, that he went to the woods to be completely by himself. And so one of the things that really stuck out to me in the book, he said he had more contact with people in those 2 years than at any other point in his life. So he just said there was always people passing by. And so I found that very interesting, and something that was not something I expected in just, he kind of offhand hearing about the book my whole life. I thought he was alone, but he lived alone, but he had ample time for people and meeting people and neighbors, and just a lot of passerbys as well.
Which actually ends up being one of the hidden, not the under-discussed positives that he gets out of this in terms of the book, and that he tries to emphasize, is saying, by not working and by just deciding to, live off of somebody else's land, in a little shack for a couple of years, I was able to do more of the stuff that, spend more time with people, do more of the stuff that I actually would have wanted to do than I would have been able to do if I'd have, tried to go out and make a living for myself, quote unquote, to work. And, that's really where he wants to go with that. So I've got a couple other, I guess I'll go with one more favorite quote, and then we'll transition. And this gets to the gist of where vagabonding goes, but I think he does it better than vagabonding. And that is the spending of the best part of one's life, earning money in order to enjoy a questionable liberty during the least valuable part of it, reminds me of the Englishman who went to India to make a fortune first in order that he might return to England and live the life of a poet. He should have gone up to the garret at once. And, that that summarizes a lot of this, to say, wait, if you're doing this in order to get that, then why don't you just get that?
Mm-hmm.
It comes a lot more cheaply than you expect. And you're wasting so much of your life in order to get allegedly to get what you want, that you're violating your values, and you're a living contradiction. All right, well, I mean, there really isn't much to transition to in terms of getting to more of the details here beyond the quotes, because so many of our quotes, we wound up getting into some of the stuff that we wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I only have a few more things, but before that, I do have to go back to my new section, which is Eric's favorite word.
Oh yes, I forgot.
And I mean, this is just unbelievable and uncanny. But last week we saw the word excrementitious in Bird for Bird, and would you believe it? It showed up again in this book.
I believe it.
So we have 2 books in a row that have used the word excrementitious. So that is just serendipitous, and I think it just means that we really need to start using it in everyday life. So very happy to see this word come up again. The second, I actually pulled out 2 favorite words. The next one was ebriosity, which means habitual intoxication. And ironically, it comes in a section where he's talking about not partaking in what we would mainly consider as intoxicating chemicals like wine. He even, in a blasphemous sentence, says we should get rid of coffee and tea. But the sentence is, of all ebriosity, who does not prefer to be intoxicated by the air he breathes? So again, going to simplicity and not needing all that, which again, not needing coffee is blasphemous to me. I know it's probably your ideal world, Jason.
He was correct on this. Coffee is the drink of dullards and servants of the man. So yeah,
I wanted to talk about one thing, and this kind of ties in with the number of people that he saw while he was there. The other thing that really struck me is he could constantly hear commerce going on, and it mostly took the form of hearing the train. But it's something I related to, because everywhere I've lived recently, if it gets really quiet in the place where I've been living, I can hear the highway. And I live in Atlanta, and I've lived off one of the main highways for the last 15 years. And so even when you're sleeping, you always have this sense that there's movement, there's things going on. And one of the greatest things when we travel is to get away from that. And I found it ironic that for Thoreau to go to Walden for 2 years to get away from it all, it's like he could still always hear the train. He could still always hear
the train
commerce.
ran basically right across Walden, like on the other side. So he was bitter about this the whole way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he would find it ironic that for you, traveling is the way that you find a way to get away from the sounds of all the hustle and bustle and travel. So yeah, that's anyway. So a couple other things worth bringing up here that I mean, we've already discussed some of his take on education, some of these things. I do want to revisit a little bit about his talk about houses and about where people live. And one of the things that he points out here is the difficulty of he basically sets things up to say an average house. I'll read the passage. An average house in this neighborhood costs perhaps $800, and to lay up this sum will take from 10 to 15 years of the laborer's life, even if he's not encumbered with a family. Estimating pecuniary value of every man's labor at $1 a day, for if some receive more, others receive less, so that he must have spent more than half his life commonly before his wigwam will be earned. If we suppose him to pay a rent instead, This is but a doubtful choice of evils. Would the savage have been wise to exchange his wigwam for a palace on these terms? That to me is a really interesting paragraph or interesting passage, and he says, he continues and he says, if it is asserted that civilization is a real advance in the condition of man, and I think that it is, though only the wise improve their advantages, it must be shown that it has produced better dwellings without making them more costly, and the cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it immediately or in the long run. And I thought that section was kind of brilliant, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Just something I was really satisfied with his... again, we've talked about this multiple times on this podcast now, but on this idea that what money is, like, don't think about it in cost terms, about dollars or anything else. I mean, he says, an average house in this neighborhood costs perhaps $800. Imagine Boston now. Yeah, $800,000.
Yeah.
But in terms of how much life it takes to get that in exchange, that's the real question. And has the cost for things gone up or down or remained the same? And really, for a lot of those things, actually, when you get around to it, the nominal cost has gone up, but generally the overall cost is often the same. In some cities or regions, the overall cost of life, as he talks about it, is the same. But again, we've talked a lot about this, that money is just a way of trading time and life. And he really makes the most of this, even to the point where he says, well, better to be the day laborer who doesn't make anything than the person who's the boss, because, the day laborer, hey, job's over when the sun goes down. The boss has to, continue stressing and working and all that. He says, but his employer, who speculates from month to month, has no respite from one end of the year to the other. And, reframing things in terms of what are you getting in exchange for all the life that you're putting into something? There's really something to that. And we would do well to think about that more often. And this book, I think, does a good job of challenging that over and over again, regardless of how much of a hypocrite Thoreau was himself.
Yeah, and I mean, I've met people who own companies, and they talk about that, the difficulty of sleeping some nights in knowing that you're responsible for so many lives and the livelihoods of these people, and not just them, but you get to meet their families. And so if you have a bad day at the office as a owner of a company, it's compounded all the more, because you're kind of thinking of, well, if this continues, then I've got employees that'll be out of a job, and then families that will suffer because of that. So he makes a good point there, but there's got to be both of those kind of people in the world too. So yeah, and that leads me into some discussion on trade as well. I didn't really agree with him on some of the stuff he said, so I'm going to read one portion, and then I want to see if you took something different out of this, or what your thoughts were on this as well. But I've since learned that trade curses everything it handles, and though you trade messages from heaven, the whole curse of trade attaches to the business. And I guess I just don't understand what he's talking about there, because for me, trade is doing what you do best and then trading that for what someone else does best. So if you guys are both doing your best and you're trading that, I don't see what the huge curse is or the evil in that.
Yeah, I think I think there's one other place where, in terms of trade and how markets work and so on, I tend to disagree with with the perspective that he took. In that, I think he fundamentally tended to take a complete scarcity-based approach, in that the way that people make money, or the way that people get rich, is by necessarily taking advantage of those below them. Or you see that in a few cases you see, some skepticism about, how markets work at all.
So it's a fixed pie for him.
Yeah, I don't know that he would necessarily entirely go with the fixed pie idea, but it seems to me that he tends more often than not to operate from the assumption of a fixed sized pie, rather than the idea that, you can actually make money. You can actually improve things by increasing the size of the pie. And so you're not actually necessarily impoverishing someone else to make your money. You're actually making others better off as well by increasing the size of the pie so that there's more to go around. And yeah, your piece is larger, but there's also larger for everybody else. I mean, it's something that we've seen over the years, that, the size of the pie can increase. Now, I think his skepticism is warranted in that you can increase the size of the pie, but if the pieces aren't as nutritionally satisfying, then it's a fool's errand. It's a Faustian bargain that you've traded all this extra time and so on for luxuries that don't actually improve the real quality of things.
Okay, and so I can see that.
I think he's got a point there.
And kind of to what we were talking about before with having too many things. And it makes me think of like a H&M store for clothing, where the whole idea is that it's not good quality. You're not actually increasing the quality of clothing in the world. You're decreasing it, but it's so you can throw the stuff away after wearing it a few times, because that's all it's meant to last. But is that like a truly beneficial thing to society? Maybe it is, but it's worse quality clothing. So
right, exactly.
Maybe that's more of the lines he's going on here. And then just he kind of had a negative view of work. One passage on labor, but labor of the hands, even when pursued to the verge of drudgery, is perhaps never the worst form of idleness. It has a constant and imperishable moral, and to the scholar it yields a classic result. So labor of the hands, it sounds like it's okay for him. Did you get that out of that passage?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
But labor of the hands, even when pursued to the verge of drudgery, is perhaps never the worst form of idleness. It has a constant and imperishable moral, and to the scholar it yields a classic result.
So yeah, he's edging towards kind of where Marx goes with this idea that, it's a almost an inherent good for somebody to labor with his hands, and generally they're speaking of to labor with his hands for specific measurable purpose. So, when you're building a house and you labor with your hands all day. On your hands would be harder to build a house that way. When you're laboring with your hands all day, at the end of the day, you can see progress and you get satisfaction, this inherent satisfaction with seeing the immediate fruit of your labor. And that's one of the things that Marx is really obsessed with, is this idea of in a capitalist system where labor is divided and economies of scale demand that somebody works on something in order to, works on one piece of something and then really only is working in order to obtain the necessary capital to trade for something else. And you don't really get to experience or see the real fruit, the real outcome, the real work of your hands. Then for Marx, what that produces is a sense of alienation in a human being, where you get that you're detached from the labor, from the fruit of the work of your hands, and you have this gnawing sense of alienation inside that is not good. And so, the factory worker can't take pride in and can't, enjoy the benefits of his work in the same way that, say, a fisherman can, who sees the catch and gets to go home and eat the result of his own hands, right?
Yeah, and I can see that, and probably even more so today, where you're working on a computer, or tons of people work in a financial industry where you're making money on money.
Right.
I can see that. Yeah.
And so the complaint for Marx is basically, and he's drawing on that same insight, like, tomatoes grown in your own garden are so much tastier than the ones that you buy at the store, right? Now, in a double-blind test, you probably couldn't tell the difference. In fact, they've done some tests on this, and people can't tell the difference between what they've grown in their own garden as a rule or what they bought in the store. But if they know they grew it in their garden, they do enjoy it more.
All right. So then why? So what happens if that guy grows so many tomatoes that he can't possibly consume them all, and as a result, he has to trade?
Yeah. See,
Then
that's
he turns
where
into a bad man for.
Well, see,
for
that's where
Walden?
that's where this comes into. That's where the problem draws. And for Marx, the idea is, well, you shouldn't work to produce that excess, basically, or you shouldn't have to. And even if you do, you're actually getting to trade the full product of the work of your hands for something that's the full product of someone else's. So that kind of trade is okay.
Mm-hmm.
But it's when you get capitalized to now where you're working for someone else to do a piece of a small piece of a work where you can't actually be attached to the work itself, and you're only getting paid a wage rather than having the thing that you're building itself. Then at that point you're introducing different levels in this, and now you're detached from the work of your hands, and that produces that alienation. Now, again, that's Marx and not Thoreau, but I do think Thoreau's on the more or less the same kind of wavelength here, to where he's saying, yeah, well, people don't work enough with their hand. Like, educated men have forgotten, who are working on these little pieces of this or making money on money. They've forgotten the benefits of and the lessons taught by going out and building something with your hands. And it's true. Like when you work on a computer all the time, there really is something satisfying about like getting away and going and chopping wood, or doing something manual where you can look back and you can go, hey, I just did that.
I done did that.
Right. Or even just like look at how, if you work out in the fields as a farmer all day, odds that you're a part of, say, a CrossFit gym are pretty diminished. Right? Those gyms are populated by urban workers or suburban workers who generally don't do anything with their hands or their bodies. And so they've got to get together to actually do something where they can see results. And one of the things that CrossFit really figured out is you get people to compete with themselves and record their times and their weights and all that in some sort of competitive way. And it's satisfying because you get to see progress. Mm-hmm. And that's something that Thoreau's talking about here. And I think he's basically right.
Yeah, I agree with him on that. The trade thing still trips me up. And especially he writes like glowingly about the fact that Walden Pond in wintertime creates ice that is then enjoyed by people from Cairo, Egypt to South America. He loves the fact that that they can partake of the pond. But that's trade.
Yep. And again, it's the result of some having more and some having less, which he thinks is not, he complains about, but he recognizes that it is the way that things are. And in some ways it's not a bad thing, but he is uncomfortable with it. And I think it's actually kind of right for us to be a little bit uncomfortable with it, with the results of how things go, even though we are better off if we all have an agreed upon way to trade and the marketplace works. Mm-hmm. We just have to make sure that the marketplace works efficiently and well, and that, that not everybody, that some people aren't completely left behind.
Yeah. Okay. That makes it a little more palatable, I guess. So anything else you liked in the or wanted to highlight in the nitty-gritty section?
Yeah, I guess the last thing is his idea that there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil for every one who is striking at the root. And it may be that he who bestows the largest amount of time and money on the needy is doing the most by his mode of life to produce that misery which he strives in vain to relieve. It is the pious slave breeder devoting the proceeds of every 10th slave to buy a Sunday's liberty for the rest.
Yikes.
And his views on the slave trade have really aged well. His views on slavery have really aged well. His conscience on this thing and his calling people to account on this have really aged well. And again, I think that insight that, oh yeah, that's great that you're giving to charity and that's great that you're doing, but the things that you're doing to get the money that you're giving to charity may have actually been the very sorts of things that have caused the conditions that have created the charity. So maybe you should just stop doing that. Or in some cases, as you might see by, watching the very good documentary Poverty Inc., you might discover that the very means of charity that is being implemented actually sustains and helps create the poverty that is allegedly being fixed by the charity. So it exacerbates it. So I think he would be totally on board with that idea of unintended consequences in economics. And, he wants to call people to consider what are the unintended and in some cases intended consequences of the things that you do that you're supposedly trying to undo by other nice things. And, hacking away at the branches with charity or with social programs and so on doesn't fix anything if you don't get to the root that's causing the problems. Yeah. I really liked that idea.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those books. I mean, we could just keep talking forever and ever. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it.
Yep, I did too. So let's go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah, first thing I'd say is a lot of important concepts in this book. Simplicity, nature, trading time for things. But I don't think you need to go into a cabin in the woods to begin to live deliberately. And the interesting thing is at the end of the book, he says that he stopped living at Walden after the 2 years, 2 months, because it had become a routine. Like the life at the cabin had become a routine. And I think we still have this idea to some degree, like we need to find ourselves by getting away, or we need to travel for a year or do something like this. And you see that in this book of, he had to get away to Walden to try to get back to, I think he was really trying to get back to childhood in a lot of ways, because he spent so much time at Walden as a child, but trying to get away from it all. But I think one point in maybe what we've seen in some of the other books is that you can decide to begin living deliberately right now where you are. You don't have to get away in the middle of nowhere to do that. I think you can start by doing small things each day and grasping onto some of the concepts that he talks about in the book. So that was one thing. I know, Jason, you mentioned that the second half of the book was not as thrilling as the first part. I liked both sections. I mean, the second part for me just kind of made me remember or think of childhood a lot. I spent a lot of time outdoors in Minnesota and Wisconsin, especially on lakes. So just Walden Lake, I just kind of pictured the lake I fished on as a kid with my grandpa in Wisconsin. And so those nature parts, I really enjoyed reading those. He'd get in a canoe in the middle of the night, Thoreau would, and go out to the middle of the lake and just look at the stars and listen to the sounds. And I really enjoyed that. And then that ant battle, the epic ant battle was just priceless. I mean, that was an awesome thing, and that I didn't know existed. And referring back to one of the other books in this series, the vagabonding book, which I was not a huge fan of. vagabonding is pretty much the modern day version of Walden to some degree. And in fact, he quotes this book throughout. Rolf Potts does in Vagabonding. I know Tim Ferriss loves it, but just skip Vagabonding and read this one instead. Read Walden. You'll get a lot more out of it, I guarantee you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And actually, I mean, we talked about this even in the Vagabonding episode. Like half of the quotes in there that I was like, oh man, that's really good. Half of the quotes were from Walden to begin with. So
yeah.
Even reading that one makes you want to read Walden.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I think he does accomplish what he's trying to do. And he does, this book is really about trying to get people to assess the true value of everything. What Thoreau wants people to do on reading this book is to ask the question, are you really doing what you truly value? And if not, what needs to change? Where do you need to put your time and money to be able to put your time and money where your mouth is and where your heart supposedly lies? Or are you just lying to yourself about what you really value, and then on examination you find out that you really actually value other things more? And then if that's the case, are those values the right values? He really wants everyone to reconsider that. And this last quote is one that I think hammers it home for him. He says, "I would not have anyone adopt my mode of living on any account. For beside that, before he has fairly learned it, I may have found out another for myself. I desire that there may be as many different persons in the world as possible, but I would have each one be very careful to find out and pursue his own way, and not his father's or his mother's or his neighbor's instead. Find out what really drives you. Find out what you value. Find out what you feel, what you recognize as what you were put on the earth to do, and do that. That's really what he wants his reader to do. And this is the stimulant, or the irritant design that Thoreau has designed to try to put in someone's path to get them to rethink what those things might be. And I think he did a pretty good job of it. I mean, it's not a perfect book, but it's definitely one I think everybody should read.
Yeah. Yeah, and do what you were made to do, but just don't do it so well that you get excess and then have to trade it.
Yeah, well, we'll go ahead and skip that part. Trade. I don't have that problem with trade, but anyway. Well, that's going to do it for us today. Now, before we get out of here, just a reminder that you can follow along with us at booksoftitans.com. You can also contact us via Twitter or Instagram at Books of Titans. And of course, if you haven't already done so, you can subscribe to this podcast. You can find all of our past episodes through iTunes. Well, Apple Podcasts now, I guess. The Android Marketplace, Google Play, Stitcher, your podcast manager of choice. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please make sure to give us the most effusive and even unrealistically awesome reviews and 5-star ratings everywhere you listen, wherever you listen. And please share your favorite episodes on social media if you're enjoying it. We'll be back soon to discuss the next book, which will be Dune by Frank Herbert. On behalf of Eric, I'm Jason. This has been the Books of Titans podcast. Keep reading, keep listening, and keep improving.
Keep it selectively real.
Thanks for listening. I made this.